Okay, so today we're going to be looking at mixed economies. Yesterday we talked about three of the main types of economies, or did we? We talked about traditional, command, and market economies yesterday. And I know this stuff is not maybe your favorite thing, your most interesting thing to learn, but it's a broad overview, and it's things that we're going to be coming back to in the class. So can everybody see the screen? I just want to make sure. Just somebody yell at me and tell me yes.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay. So yesterday I told you the chapter 2 review organizer was on, and it's linked here, and it's also linked in Schoology, so you can get to that. Today, the assignment is just to read the chapter 2, lesson 2 on mixed economies and work on that review. And then by tomorrow, I'll have a Schoology up there for chapter 2. So unit 1 is chapters 1, 2, and 3. And then after chapter 3, so next week we'll be having a test. And the questions you'll find are similar to the quizzes. And also just to shout out and know that you can retake those quizzes. So if you don't get the score you want the first time, you can take it until you get the score that you want. You don't have to take it more than once, but I just wanted you to know that. So that if you don't get, if you want to get an A in the class or a B in the class, you can keep taking that quiz until you get to the point where you want it to be. All right. Okay, so we are going to be looking at mixed economies today, and they have a combination of those that we talked about yesterday, traditional, command, and market. So if you remember, traditional, and I think I have it on the next slide. Traditional economies would be when you think of like Native Americans or Aborigines or those people like still living in the Amazon, on the Amazon River that don't really interact with the outside world. Traditional economies are those where it's based on the people do the things that are necessary to survive as a culture, a society. So in a traditional economy, there might not even be money. It might be that, this group does the work that's necessary to feed the group. Another group does the things that are necessary to keep the group safe. Another group does what's necessary to clothe the kids. Another group teaches the kids. So they all work together and no money is exchanged. They just work together so that everybody in that society gets what they need. In a command economy, you're talking about a pure command economy or pure communism would be where there's one central unit and they control every aspect of life. So a government that controls what you eat, where you live, what jobs you do, those kinds of things. And they're just making sure that everybody has what they need. Truthfully, no command economies exist purely in our world. North Korea is probably the closest to that. And then the last one, market economies, really depend on supply and demand and to make them go. And there is no economy in the world that's a pure economy. Most of them are mixed, but some of them tend to be one area more than others. And we're going to look at that today. So you can see that pure economies are rare because in this day and age, unless you look, like I said, there are actually still some tribal people living in different parts of the world, different parts of Africa, different parts of the Amazon, where they don't really interact with the other world. That would only be the true traditional economy. Otherwise, most economies are mixed. Why? Why is it like that? If you read your book, it said world events lead to change. So anytime something happens in the world, it affects economies. I know you guys should have learned in U.S. history about the Great Depression. First you had World War I, then you had a time of economic boom when people had a lot of money and were spending a lot of money. And then you had the Great Depression where nobody had money. And then you have another war, which changed the American economy again. So those types of world events lead to change. And as the world changes, so do nations. They get rid of one policy, they start another. It can be the takeover. It can be something big like happened in Russia, where you went from more of a mixed economy to communism, and now they're back to more of a mixed economy. Or it can be like the United States, where certainly we had a strong government, when we started our nation, but people still had the right to choose and to own their own businesses and plantations and farms and things like that. This is not a quote. I forgot to delete this, someone famous. Mixed economies come about when people from one type of economy come into contact with other cultures, adopt their technologies and the way they do things, or when people are unhappy with the way their economy is performing. And sometimes that leads to revolution. And that still happens in our world today. Always remember that we're going to answer the what, how, and for whom questions. So in a mixed economy, the state or the government's involvement it varies. And then this is when you're answering those for what, how, and for whom to produce. Traditional economies, they're based on the needs of the society. Command decisions are centralized. Market, driven by the market, and mixed is overlapping. So remember those questions. What, how, and for whom do we produce? That's always going to be something you're going to need to know. This is from your book, but I think it's a really good diagram that you guys should take a look at because it shows overlapping. So basically, a mixed economy would be here in the middle, and you could move all these things to the middle because there's a combination. So market, capitalistic, traditional, and socialist economies or command economies. What you'd want to do is look at this and then decide, for what, how, and for whom are things produced. And it's determined by the type of system that it is. And in a mixed economy, it might be determined by all these things. It might be determined by private ownership, tradition, as well as government. Your book talks a lot about examples of different types of mixed economies, and it really, I'm not sure why, focuses on communist and mixed socialism. Communist is, and you guys know that word, communism. It's based on this theory that everyone contributes according to their abilities and consumes what they need, and that the government is the one that's kind of in control of that. We don't have anything like that exactly in the world today, but we do have socialism. And a lot of European countries especially are socialist, meaning that the government owns and controls some things, but not all things. There's still private resources, but they own and control maybe more than we do here in America. For example, healthcare is centralized in most European countries. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that at the end of class. And you guys are going to answer some questions then. I'm going to stop talking at you. Mixed market economies have elements of social and traditional economies, and also some social and some command type things too, actually. And the US is a market economy that's mixed. Okay, so I'm going to just do this little thing here. So do you guys know anything about the countries on the screen? And if you want to shout out now, that would be great. Anybody? So when you're looking at communism and looking at this list, Russia, the United States, South Korea, China, Cuba, North Korea, and India, which one do you think is the most communist out of those, where the government controls?
North Korea.
North Korea, good. Which one do you think is the farthest to the right over here when you're talking about capitalism, where everything is driven by this free market idea?
India?
Yeah, nice job. Was that Amy?
No. Yeah.
Nice job. Yeah, I think India is the furthest to the right. Anybody hazard to guess where the US would be? So the US would fall here. And why socialism is here is because we do have some government-run things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, public schools, those kinds of things. Cuba would probably be the next one here. South Korea also is capitalistic. It's very different than North Korea. Probably here. Russia is somewhere here, and then China is somewhere over here. So just seeing that continuum sometimes helps people understand that on the far left here are those countries that the government controls almost everything. And then on the far right is that most of the nation is run by the people that live there, by the free market economy. Not that they don't have government intervention in things, they certainly do. It's just maybe not to the extent of these nations over here. Okay, so nice job on that. Okay, advantages and disadvantages. So advantages would be that assistance is provided for people who might be left out of the country's economic progress. So for example, in America, if you are struggling, if you're poor, you may be able to get assistance from the government in the form of food stamps or welfare payments to help support a family and to be able to live. Also, when you think about Social Security, we pay into that from the time that we start working. After you retire, you actually get some of that money back from the government, where you get a Social Security check, and the government manages that. They also manage Medicare, which is healthcare for the elderly. So another advantage is that economic growth is generally much faster than with command economies. Some disadvantages is that there are higher tax rates in countries with mixed economies to support programs that are here. It's okay. There's limited availability of services or decreasing quality of services. So this isn't necessarily in America, but they do say that in some socialist countries, it's harder to get things that you want because the government runs it, which is less efficient. That's this next one. Governments are likely to see market-oriented reforms as a threat. In other words, governments would favor some of those socialist ideas where the government is in control of things over individual-owned things. And that's just the way it is. Our government is always going to focus in America on government-run programs, and they're going to probably favor those over individuals. Or they might favor big business over small business. So there's definitely some advantages and some disadvantages when you're looking at that mixed economy system. Like I said, I know this stuff isn't probably things that you guys are super interested in, but you're going to see these things come up, so it's a good base for the whole class. Because remember, this is just the intro unit. And then the last thing I just want is for you guys to just a little discussion, and I'll go through this slide first, and then I'm going to come back to the full group, is that over 40 million Americans currently live without insurance to cover their healthcare costs, or enough to cover them. 80% of those people without insurance come from poor working class families. Even though most Americans believe we should have access to affordable healthcare coverage, we're not willing to pay for it through taxes. So how do we make it happen? And then just some things to think about and we're going to talk about. So if the government pays for healthcare, who pays for it? What happens to the insurance industry where millions of people work? If you have government-run healthcare, will the coverage be the same? Would the procedures be the same? Would individuals have to pay out of pocket for non-life-threatening procedures that they might be able to get covered through their health insurance now? Could the wealthy buy healthcare for those extra things that the average person couldn't afford? So I'm going to come back to our main screen before we get to questions. I'm going to stop screen sharing.